So yes, my talk this morning is about a human-centric approach to smart buildings. Now, this, I think, is a question that the building controls industry has pretty much obsessed with for a long time. What is a smart building? Now, there are many answers, and I think a lot of them seem to focus on some narrow definition about what systems there are or are not. And to be quite honest with you, I think it's a waste of time. It's the wrong question that we should be asking. A better question to me is, what is the purpose of this building? And is this building fulfilling that purpose? Because it's not just about being technical, it's about the purpose of the building. And I would hazard a guess that a lot of you know exactly what it's like to, experience a building that doesn't fulfill its potential. Could even be a daily occurrence. And take a look around you today. I don't know where, obviously, you guys are in the world or where you're working, but, I imagine a few of you are working remotely at home at the moment. And that's a really interesting dynamic, of course. How are you balancing this work and life mix? Have you been able to separate part of your home, house, apartment off to use specifically for work, for that purpose? Or do you not have the space? And indeed, what does it feel like? Is it too warm? Have you even, had to open a window maybe to let some fresh air in? But then at the same time, you're having to compete with noise from outside. Are you even concentrating? Are you listening to me now? Or are you maybe looking at your phone or something else? It really is, about the purpose of the building. And I think as an industry in construction, I think over the last few years, even before that, we've done a pretty good job of producing more output, more buildings. But have we really done a good job with outcomes? Are we really producing buildings that are fit for purpose? And for me, I think that's really where technology fits into this. So I hope what you can see now is a simplified illustration of the life cycle of your typical commercial building. What we see along the top here, the timeline, are basically the three phases of this life cycle: design, build, and the operate and maintain phase. So design and build, depending, of course, on what type of building you're constructing, could be anywhere around 5 years. And then we move into operate and maintain. And I'm reliably informed that your average office lifetime is around 65 years. If we then look at the next line, I've identified some of the key stakeholders within these different phases. And of course, we start with the person, the organization that puts in the idea and the money behind the project. It could be the investor, the owner, operator, or developer. And at some point, they're going to appoint the design team, which will be made up generally of an architect, a structural engineer, building services engineer, and quantity surveyor. And they're going to be responsible for the conceptual design and develop design. And then as we move into the actual build phase, a main contractor will be appointed. And then from them, contracts will cascade down towards suppliers and subcontractors, who are each going to be responsible for delivering some part of this building. And many, of course, for delivering and installing some of the technology. And really, in some senses, what I've just described here is a legal framework. And a lot of the time, it's really just designed to mitigate risk. You know, if things go wrong, no one wants to be held responsible. And a big part of that, of course, is price. It's a massive issue. You know, in here, within this, there are a lot of low margin businesses. And for example, when we get into the build phase, it's not uncommon for systems to be engineered out, which is a nice term for basically saying that that system isn't included, you know, within the building anymore. It's taken out of the design. And then finally, at the bottom, what you can see here is the RIBA plan of work stages. And RIBA stands for the Royal Institute of British Architects. So a while back, they put together this mapping themselves about, you know, the whole construction process. And I'm sure if you go to their website, there'll be a lot more information about it. But essentially, it's 7 stages of work. Now, the most important stage is here, number 6, which is called the practical completion and handover. This is where all parties in these different silos here get to fulfill their contractual obligations and then get to move on to their next project. So good for them. Except, of course, this is just the beginning of this building's glorious life, you know? And I think actually these stages kind of really go some way to represent the mindset of some in the industry, where we have this one phase in use to describe this 65-year period of operate and maintain, yet we have 6 phases to describe just this 5-year period. So consider for a moment the aviation industry. Now, I know on the face of it, this doesn't seem like a particularly useful comparison, but I actually think construction and aviation have quite a lot in common. You know, they're both bringing to market a very highly engineered, complex product. And it combines a lot of mechanical systems and now increasingly cyber electronic systems. And take, for example, one company, let's say Rolls-Royce, they're an integral part of the aviation supply chain. As we know, they make engines, but they don't actually sell engines. You know, they sell time. They lease these engines to the carriers, and then they're responsible for all of the maintenance and diagnostics associated with that particular engine across the whole life cycle of that particular aircraft. So, you know, there's no handover, no design, build, maintain. It's one managed service across the whole life cycle of that particular aviation aircraft. This kind of joined up approach to data is not so common, I would say, in the building industry. And this analogy shows, or goes some way basically, to showing, representing data in different building systems that often exist in silos. You know, it's unlikely, for example, that the same company that, let's say, installs the access control system here is the same company that is going to install the building management system, or indeed the lighting, or something else. So systems are not integrated that often. and therefore don't share data particularly well, and don't operate to their full potential, giving the best return on investment to the customer. But you know, of course, in technology, things are changing all the time, and we've seen rapid progress over the last few decades. You know, technological trends like Moore's law, better sensor capabilities mean that we really do have the tools now to digitally understand and interpret our built environment. So, if you will, a feedback loop to connect data, understand it, and then make autonomous decisions to improve our environment. And what I've basically described there is the Internet of Things. So this is some of our research, which shows a mapping of the IoT in buildings with some of the technical systems and how they relate to each other. And there are 6 key lines in this mapping. First one, business enterprise, user experience, security, energy, lighting and signage, and finally, what we've called facilities. And I'll draw your attention here just to one area called occupancy analytics. Now, we've done some research in this area, and we found that there globally are over 220 suppliers in the global market, just in that one section of occupancy analytics. And actually, we also estimated just for that one portion in office space, that the global market is worth around 2.2 billion last year. So it's really an area that's showing some very solid growth. And we project that IoT connected devices in commercial offices will top 3 billion by 2022. So if we move on, here what I've done is show what this kind of mapping might actually look like in the real world. And this is actually a photo from the ceiling in my office building. You can see they don't have the false ceiling. So a lot of the systems now are exposed. So I'll just quickly describe some of the things that you might be able to see here, which I think are relatively interesting. First off here on the left, what's called a multifunctional control unit. And that supports communication protocols like Modbus and BACnet, and is basically part of the building management system for controlling a couple of the rooms, which you can see down here. Here, of course, running right down the corridor is all of the cabling carrying all different types of data from different systems. And of course, not just building systems, but also the enterprise, you know, all of the Wi-Fi network, et cetera, being carried. Here you can see a couple of IP CCTV cameras. Again, they're probably wiring along these trays. Up here, an air conditioning duct, which is part of, you know, the HVAC system. And again, I hope you can see this, not particularly well probably, but this is a damper actuator, and that controls, I guess, the airflow into this pipe. And then beyond that, other systems here, like the fire suppression, sprinkler, fire detection here. I think that's probably a some kind of detector of smoke. Some lighting, an emergency lighting, and then also here, an IR detector used for, in this case, I believe, occupancy sensing. So here's a question for everybody. will dumb buildings, i.e. not smart buildings, actually become stranded assets in our post-COVID economy, however that may look? But basically, is widespread adoption of net zero energy buildings achievable without IoT? And I would argue no, and I think from three perspectives. The first being the legislative. And I'll give you two examples. In the Netherlands, office buildings are going to need to meet the minimum energy performance requirements, which are called Label C, by 2023, or they won't be able to be rented out to any tenant. And it's not just Europe. Also in New York City, buildings over 25,000 square feet will need to reduce carbon emission footprints by 40% to 2030 or face financial penalties. And then there's also the sustainability perspective. And what I've seen and noted is that sustainability is an increasingly important issue within large corporations. There's much more interest in it now. And indeed, a lot of them produce reports. So there is a big need within these large organizations to reduce CO2 emissions, and especially from their facilities. And finally, from a financial perspective, I expect there to be increasing use of property data in financial models. And this could be a key driver to make buildings smart. For me, construction really isn't just about bricks and mortar. And of course, it never really has been. And as a society, we understand this on an intrinsic level. And for millennia, we've expended enormous amounts of capital on buildings, often to display messages. And those messages could be of power, of wealth, of national identity and pride. And I think increasingly in the future, the messages our buildings display will also be one of purpose and function. So those are really the slides that I wanted to show today. And I think we've had some questions come in. So if you just give me 1 second, then I'll be able to start taking them for you. And you can see there on the screen, those are my contact details if anyone wants to get hold of me. Okay. So question here, what is your vision on how we can prepare data from concept design construction phase to make sure we have a smart building ready handover database equals digital data registry? Well, I think for starts, I mentioned there, in that conceptual life cycle, within the design and build phase, you have, of course, the design team. And again, I said that was mainly made up of the architect, structural engineer, building services engineer, quantity surveyor, which is great. And of course, that's how it's been done for many years. And I know now that there are people who are sort of advocating that actually part of that design team should include a technical consultant, a smart buildings consultant. Because really, you want to get technology into the design phase as early as possible. And that, I think, is probably the easiest way to do it. I mean, sometimes you get lucky, you can have a great owner-operator, let's say like some big multinational tech company who have their own facilities design team, who are like super knowledgeable about technical building systems and know exactly what they want. And that will be part of their specification. As those specifications go down, to the subcontractors, there's going to be no ambiguity. But really what I described first off there was, the kind of way things are at the moment. So I think that would be, my biggest piece of advice for anyone doing this. And of course, we're talking about new construction here. I haven't really there touched retrofit or refurbishment, and those in themselves are slightly different. And there is an argument, let's say, as you move through those phases of design towards build, in some senses you may be better at that point, to engineer those systems in later as part of retrofit. In terms of ready handover database equals digital data registry, I'm not exactly sure, but of course there's a lot of being done with BIM now at the moment. So, even in the UK, BIM is mandated on government buildings, and I think that's actually been quite successful. And as we move towards, much more BIM and being used and digital twins, then I think we'll start seeing the benefit of that. Next question, what developed in smart buildings are you most enthusiastic about? That is a good question. Again, to me, it's not so much about the technology. I think it's actually more about the adoption. I think we are really seeing now some clients, be they owner operator or developer, who are really interested in technology now. And an educated, knowledgeable client is great. They know exactly what they want, and they really are pushing, I think, ahead, pushing the boundaries of what, is possible in terms of, creating great environments for their staff to work in. And I'm sure most of you know who those companies are. So that to me is really exciting, because ultimately, those are like the real marquee projects. And I think actually, there'll be a trickle down effect where people see what is possible, and companies will, who perhaps hadn't thought about what is achievable will in the end think that they can get that as well. Which building in the world do you like the most and why? Well, it's probably not so much from a technical perspective. I mean, we could look at that from an architectural perspective as well. I mean, I live here in Stockholm. There's some interesting buildings here. Yeah, there's a really old, well-established architectural firm called Tengbom here, and that architect in the 1930s produced some really interesting buildings here in Stockholm. And again, I'm from London as well. There's some fantastic buildings there. Yeah. How is COVID going to help or not to create more smart buildings? Yeah, I'm pretty buoyant actually about what's happening at the moment. We talk to a lot of technology companies out there who are working within IoT. I mentioned occupancy analytics. Actually, we're seeing there that there's some really useful use cases within occupancy analytics to look at social distancing. So of course, if you know how many people are in the building and you know where they are, then you can really manage that space much more effectively. And we need to do that now with social distancing. As we move kind of post-COVID, I would hope that, people, because they've then experienced that technology, they will, see the benefits of that longer term. Yeah, so it is, I think, really gonna help us to get more technology, get better technology into buildings and make them fit for purpose. Next question, what is the most compelling argument to convince a tenant occupier to invest in smart building tech? Which bottom line results are to be achieved? This isn't my, big area of expertise, but I think that ultimately what's going to be compelling is that it's not about the technology, it's about what the building does and how it functions and its purpose. If you can create a building that is not just looks great, but is also a better environment for people's employees, I think you can then sell that as a force multiplier in some senses. You say, look, you want to attract the best people to come and work for you, and you want to retain those people, and this is the building that's going to help you do that. Can you elaborate on best practices where tech and smart building application really helps an employee or customer experience? I think that there are so many use cases now where, you know, it does help. I mean, we're doing some work with the client at the moment to produce some research around this. I think ultimately it's about managing, you know, I mean, just even on a level of like health level, you know, good air quality, good access to natural light, sunlight, biophilia, you know, okay, we haven't done enough work, I don't think, to really measure the impact of that, but I think that's going to create a great space for people, and ultimately, I believe, will make them more productive. And that's going to be the best measure, isn't it? Productivity and you know, for example, sick days, things like that. Do you think a shift is required in the industry business model to ensure owner-operators, designers, investors are more invested in long-term future of the buildings? Yeah, I absolutely do. We are going to have to shift the thinking of those involved in the design and build phase. And I think it's happening. I've seen some moves now by, you know, actually companies now who are involved in the whole life cycle to actually take ownership. And I think that they're going to be looking at different business models, different ways of managing that whole process. So yeah, it's interesting, and I think a shift is required. Which landlord do you consider the most forward-thinking in terms of smart building adoption? It would be interesting to see more real-world usage cases. Yeah, again, great question. This isn't really my absolute, you know, interest here. We kind of look more at the you know, market research of the technology. But a couple of companies that I think are interesting, developers, Lend-Lease. I think it's worth seeing what they're up to. And also there's a company in the Netherlands. They run the technology, edge technologies, and they're called OVG Real Estate. They're producing some really, really interesting buildings as well. Worth keeping an eye on them. You have described value engineering systems out of the building's design. Yes, I have, and suggested a case for retrofitting smart systems rather than installing from the outset. I'm not, well, it depends basically, but certainly if a lot has been engineered out and you're coming to the end of the build phase or you're not that technical, there hasn't been enough technology thought of in the design phase, I think in some cases it's better to retrofit it. Can you give real fiscal and temporal examples of the latter? Unfortunately, I can't. It's not something we've researched. In our experience, trying to build a case for retrofitting smart technologies into commercial properties has been near impossible. I could not disagree with you more. Fair enough. Again, I'm not saying that there is, well, what I am saying is in certain circumstances, I think it is actually, it would be a better way of doing it. If you've got to the end of, you know, towards the end of the design and build phase, and as you said, that things are being value engineered out, what are you going to do? And I think ultimately, in some circumstances, with the best client or the best partners during that the operate and maintain phase, it would be a better way of doing it.